Spokane River is a tributary of the Columbia River in eastern Washington. It flows 111 miles starting in Idaho and then coming through Spokane and then heads north towards the Columbia River. Of course, it's dammed up and not free-flowing when it gets down to the Spokane arm of the Lake Roosevelt. But there's a good fishery up through Spokane and down below Spokane a little bit. Today we're below Spokane, and we just came here because we had a tip from a friend, but you can see it's a big river, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we first approached this and what we decided to do and how we decided to fish this big river. So when we got down to this hole, we looked around and just saw the lay of the land, the lay of the river. And the main river flows under this bridge here. You can see a heavy flow, and it's heading down from right to left. What we see in front of us here is a big back eddy. So down below to the left, it back eddies, comes back along, and you can see it still has a strong current right here in the back eddy. So what we thought, we'd give it a try. There's some current there. There's a nice slow area off of the current in front of me. There's a spot out here which is a little tougher to get to, but we eventually wade out and get to that. This first area in front of me, I'm guessing, is 4 to 6 feet deep. Out in here, probably more 8 to 10. And then there's a nice area just below this whole thing that slows down off the current, and these were the areas we decided to target. And in a little bit I'm going to talk about how we decided to target these areas. So we came armed with a few different options for fishing. We had a nymph rig set up under a strike indicator. We I think started with a Pat's rubber legs and probably a pheasant tail nymph on one of the rods, but we had heard that streamers were working well, so we decided to start with streamers, and we had one of them on a floating line, which we knew wouldn't get as deep, and then the one that really was the most effective was we used a sink tip line. And you can see here Aladdin fighting a fish. This turns out to be a smallmouth bass. And what we did here was just used the sink tip line as a 5-weight rod, a 3X tippet. We figured these could be pretty good sized fish. The water wasn't real clear, so we wanted to use a pretty good tippet size. And we also, thought a 5-weight rod would be enough. Although, as it turned out, casting was kind of a premium. The size of the river, a 7-weight rod certainly would have been helpful to get the fly out there a little bit further. Some beautiful flowers along the side, so you can see what Ladin's doing right here. He's casting out as far as he can with a sink tip line, and then he's stripping it back in, letting it go out in that spot in front of him, and stripping it back in and hoping to get a strike. And I'm doing the same thing down below with a floating line. And we just kind of traded back and forth to see what would work, but definitely the sink tip line was the one that was the most effective. The reason for using a sink tip line is just because of the depth of the river. We really didn't know for sure, but we assumed it would be a fairly deep in spots. And so there were some shallow areas, there were some deep areas. The sink tip gets it down a little bit deeper, and then you can also, once it gets down deeper, then you can strip fairly quickly using the streamers and add some action to it without bringing it up quite as high to the surface.
Yeah.
All right. Good trout.
So again, the idea as you watch Ladin release this fish, the idea was to cast across the river, a little bit, sometimes downstream, sometimes upstream, depending on what depth we wanted to get to. Let our fly sink as much as we could, Sometimes we'd bring it right across, sometimes we would let it sink, and you can see he's pointing out to where we would cast, and then strip and pull the line. And we varied the way we pulled the line. Sometimes we do long pulls, sometimes we do short pulls, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, and just trying to find out what the fish liked the best. And it really did depend too. Sometimes they would take it various different ways, so it's just good to vary things up. You could see right there I was doing short strips, short quick strips, and other times I would be doing longer pulls. Again, some kind of basic things to think about when you're first coming up to a new water and you don't really know what you're doing necessarily. Streamers can be a really good way to kind of cover lots of water, and so that's what we started with. You can use either floating line or a sinking line too would work, but you just need to strip faster so that you don't get it stuck on bottom. Or a sink tip oftentimes can be a good option. You want to use from a 5-weight probably to a 7-weight rod, typically, depending on the size of the river. This being a big river, anywhere in that range would be fine. And then once you have kind of covered the water in various different ways, you can switch up streamers, patterns, and then you could even start working with nymphs, which is what we did next. And of course the streamer makes a big difference. You can see this one has a fairly heavy weight at the top on its head, and both of the flies we used were quite heavy. Again, because big river, you tend to want to go a little bit deeper, typically, not always, but that was kind of my thinking as we approached this river for the first time. Here I wanted to show you the river in the other direction from where we were facing the camera before. The main river is out in here and it's flowing in this general direction. The river continues on there. And again, this somewhere in here it back eddies and comes around. Not quite down that far, starting in here probably. And back eddies back through here. So we fished this, and then later on in the afternoon I ended up coming up into this area and fishing out in here. In front of that there was a nice slick. It was shallower, but it was a good area for fishing as well. As evening moved on, started getting a little darker, the pulling of the streamer patterns wasn't working quite as well, so it was like time to switch, do something else. We had tried a couple nymphs and hadn't done too well with them, so I decided to move up into this area that I showed you just a little bit ago, the flat above, and it's actually downriver, but it's the way the back eddy is turning, it actually is coming from left to right, and it's shallower up there and slower. So, but I wanted to use a streamer and not have to strip it too fast, so what I did is I put a streamer under, you can see the strike indicator there, I put a streamer under a strike indicator a couple of feet and let that flow down through that area so it wouldn't get hung up on the rocks. And sure enough, on the first or second cast, I think it was, it hooked up with that fish, and I caught that nice fish there. So just kind of changing tactics, trying some different things. I had tried the streamer up there, but I was hitting bottom too much and pulling it too fast. So we came back, that was the last fish we caught that evening. We came back a couple weeks later, as you can see, and we hiked down a little further this time. We went past those first two holes that we fished and went down to some other water that previously people had been fishing. And you can see here, I'm going to pause this and kind of talk about this. On this day, we started out again in the evening, and we walked down further, but we started with the same tactics that were so successful the 2 weeks before, with streamer patterns on one floating line and one sink tip, and again the sink tip was the most effective. So we had been up above here previously, so we hiked downriver and the stream is flowing this way again. so it's downstream from where we fished previously. This is sort of a similar hole, not as big. The current comes by here pretty quick. We're on a little point that sticks out and blocks the river a little bit, moves the river, and the main current comes flowing right through here, and right in here you get a back eddy that brings the flow back around. You get a little bit of stagnant water. There's water moving all in this area, and this was a great spot. Fish would hold in here and this area, and then they would, I think, come out to feed, and there was enough current in here too that there were fish actually facing this direction and getting food as it came down to them in the back eddy. So the second time we came here, we had a better idea of what to do. We knew what had worked, so we just kind of went right back to the same strategy. We did switch a little bit and use a sinking line as well as the sink tip line and the floating line. And the sink tip line and the sinking line both worked. The sinking line when it was a little bit deeper, the sink tip a little bit intermediate, and the floating when we needed for shallower water. And we caught several fish right in this area, in this little scallop, and all out into the current as well as in the back eddy.
I don't know if this cloud cover has helped. Seems like the bite.
We kept catching fish throughout most of the evening with that same tactic, streamers with those kind of rods. It slowed down a little bit, but really we didn't need to change. I noticed that there were some fish rising, so I decided to go ahead and give it a shot with a dry fly. I really hadn't planned on any kind of dry fly activity because just such a big river and streamers and all that kind of stuff. So we're working effectively. But I saw some fish right, and I saw some caddisflies hatching, and I had just these big, chubby Chernobyl black kind of ant patterns. They're huge, size 6. So I put one on just to give it a try, and I put it, laid it out in the back eddy, so it came swirling around pretty slowly. And sure enough, fairly soon after trying it, a fish hit. And after that, we were able to fish the rest of the evening through dark, really up to dark, with dry flies. We switched over because it was so much more fun to see these fish coming up to the dry fly, and that's the way we fished for the rest of the evening.
That's fun.
I just used a 9-foot 5-weight fly rod here again with the dry fly, a floating line, about a 9-foot leader with 3x tippet. I might have switched over to 4x tippet just because it was on the surface. Typically you want a little lighter tippet when you're dry fly fishing. And once we discovered this kind of set of tactics for this river at this time, we were able to come back again one time later, use the streamers early on in the day, in the middle of the day, into the afternoon. We did catch a few on nymphs as well, and then switch over to the dry flies in the evening. So, just learn something here about this river. Really good. Get some information. Switch tactics, especially as the evening progresses, and especially if you're not being successful. But just sometimes it's fun to try different tactics. Be able to switch up quite a bit is a really good way to just find different ways to catch fish when you're coming up to a water, particularly one that you don't know. So as we walk out of the Spokane River, I want to say thanks for watching, and please subscribe to our YouTube channel.